Dan Nelson, great to have you in today's show. How are you doing?
Doing great. Glad to be here today.
Well, I'm just glad to have you, and it's great that we are going to continue our story from last week. And the greatest thing is that this happened 137 years ago to the day, June 6, 1863. Tell me more about that.
Well, it just happened to be that 137 years ago it matched up. And what happened on this day was that three Confederate companies of the 20th Mississippi came into the camp that they'd sort of built this shelter, and they paroled them. So he says they came into camp, they paroled us, and he says, we give our name to and receiving the oath from Lieutenant Hayes of the above spoken regime. So they didn't look at these as Confederates as buddies when they used the word regime. And he says, sorry to be paroled, but cannot avoid it. And so you might ask, well, why would he be sorry to be paroled? Well, I don't understand that. Well, times were different back then. So what happened is if the enemy captured you and didn't turn you into a prisoner of war, they paroled you. Well, that parole meant that on your honor, you would no longer take up arms against your enemy. So both sides did this, Union and Confederate. So if you were captured and you took an oath and said, I won't fight against you again, you didn't get out of the military, but you then ended up with a non-combatant job. So it was sort of a big deal. It's like saying I'm being disarmed, which is sort of shameful. I mean, that's sort of the sense of honor they had back then. So next day, Sunday, June 7th, he says, have some interesting time gathering and eating blackberries, have a small piece of bone taken from my wound on the side of my head. You know, no big deal. Get some blackberries, have some bones removed from your head. Next day, he says, 45 ambulances arrive late in the evening to remove us. My wound is gaining slowly. Next day, get in the ambulances, and these ambulances are just wagons. You know, there was no, not when we think of an ambulance nowadays. And start near noon for Sherman's Landing, as in General Sherman, on the Yazoo River. Take supper near sundown at the Black River Bridge and immediately renew our journey. And the last day that I'm going to share the daily diary entry, June 10th, is have a very disagreeable night's travel as sleep was out of the question. Arrived at the landing near 6 o'clock and hurried on the hospital boat, City of Memphis, by heavy rain, which was coming fast. So that sort of gets him to where he's at on his journey, and then we'll talk more about what became of him.
So on June 10th, okay, so that's interesting too. You were talking about the ambulance. So we're talking about a horse-drawn carriage, right?
Correct.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, nothing special. There was no like extra layers of comfort or anything built in. There was just a wooden wagon bouncing around on muddy, backwoods Mississippi roads.
Aren't y'all glad? I mean, I know 2020 has been a real frustrating year, but I mean, come on, that's something that we're glad that we have, right?
Yeah, we're pretty whiny by comparison. So
We are. And so on the Wednesday on June 10th, here we are in the city of Memphis, huh?
yeah, that's the name of the boat that they were actually in, and they headed up to St. Louis, and St. Louis is where the hospital was that he was put into to recuperate from his pretty significant injury.
So they actually had hospital boats back then?
Yeah, they had hospital boats, and then they had hospital, built sort of behind the front line. So St. Louis was the closest safe place where they were away from the Confederacy, and they could build hospitals and know the guys wouldn't, get attacked in the hospital.
Oh, I didn't even think about an ambush in the hospital.
Well, it could certainly happen if you were in a frontier type of hospital.
So, okay, so what's next? What happens? Because, we're kind of looking and we're like, gosh, what happens to this guy? What happens to his life? Does anything happen really spectacular for him?
Well, he ends up recuperating, and then as part of his parole, he stayed in the military, but he became a nurse at a hospital in Indianapolis, and then he returned after the war to his hometown in Indiana. There's stories in the family about his wife made the eye patches for him because he was a war hero. This was a big deal. You weren't like treated poorly if you had scars from war or whatever. They traveled to Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma, finally settled in northeast Kansas, and he was a prosperous farmer. So even with the dust getting in his eye in a dust storm, he was able to succeed as a farmer. He was an avid writer and reader, and he lived to 87 years of age. He even talked about the theory of evolution in his writings.
Really? So let me ask you. So back in the day, I guess, did he just wear a patch the whole time, or did they have the glass? Did they have the ability to have a glass eye, or was that even around at that point in time?
I don't know about the glass eyes. He wore a patch. He definitely wore a patch. So we only have one picture of him post-Civil War where you could see him face on, and so I'm gonna try and show that up there. Yeah, so you can see his one eye there where it's sort of looks like it's closed. Okay, well, he wasn't winking. So that picture he had to have taken for his disability claim, that he filed as a soldier. But all the other pictures that were ever taken of him, he was turned to the side, so everybody else would be looking forward and he'd be looking to the side. In a few pictures, one of his daughters or somebody else would do the same thing to sort of balance the picture in terms of the symmetry, but never a face-forward picture where you could see it again. So I was fortunate to get this picture, and an uncle of mine had it. This is sort of a cool thing too. So these are his eyeglasses that he wore after the Civil War. So you may not be able to see the fogging that's in the. Let me get the camera there. So on the one side it's fogged. There you go. Okay, it's sort of weird holding it backwards to the camera. But this side here, over here, is fogged where my finger is, because you don't want to have, when you can only see through one eye, have the distraction of seeing things peripherally, so they actually fog it out. So these glasses have survived to today. They're in the hands of a relative, and so I borrowed them for this show. This is a mini ball, which is what was shot and hit him in the eye. It's a little hard to see there with the reflection on the plastic, but similar in size right here to probably the tip of your finger. So
that's like a bullet. That's like, what is that made out of?
It would steel. You know, it's other than I'd lose it, I'd take it out of the package, but it's steel. And yeah, it would definitely do some damage if you got shot with it. Of course, these things are just flying everywhere during battle. It's not like somebody set and carefully aimed at his head or something like that. It's just random whether you got hit or not and where you got hit, because, you know, it goes over and hits him. You know, it came in right below here. Well, if it came in above and severed his artery, he'd have just bled to death on the battlefield. So it's just random. You know, you're lucky if you got shot in the leg or the arm or something like that versus in the heart.
So he traveled to Pikes Peak in 1901. That's interesting. And then he became a writer, and he lived to 87 years old, and you said that he prescribed to Darwinism. That's very interesting.
Yeah, so he, you know, this was back when you had Clarence Darrow and the monkey trials and all that kind of stuff. And so he wrote a lot about, you know, what God said and what the theories of evolution said. Of course, they called it Darwinism versus theory of evolution then. And it was interesting to see, you know, sort of his writing out loud as he sort of reconciled those things in his mind, because there was, for the first time, evidence of evolution, yet he was a God-fearing person that studied the Bible. So, you know, working through those things, no different than we work through them today, but he did back then and recorded his thoughts on it. Here's some more pictures here. I don't know how well you'll see them, but it gives you an idea of what our books look like. This is a book we put together on him that I got it.
This is interesting. So right now for everybody on the radio, it's really cool because he's our resident genealogist. So he's actually showing us some of the books that they put together, showing all the family relatives and it's really neat because if you look at like this historical reference right here, I mean, this goes back, we're talking about stuff from 137 years ago. You know, a lot of us sit there and think that the shopping center down the street was built in 1987 and that was pretty old. You're like, whoa, that was pre-90s. That was pre-90s, you know. Oh, that was glass brick time. Remember those little glass bricks that they had you make the bathrooms and stuff out? Everybody's like, that's 1975. But Dan, you know, really quick, because I think that a lot of folks want to know, you know, how are you able to find all this and compile something of this magnitude to be able to provide this type of information and to see it as you know, so clearly? Because a lot of times there's all these fragmented stories, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the fragmented stories, and I describe it as it's putting together a puzzle. The only thing is, when I start, I don't know what the front of the box looks like. So I don't want to lose any pieces, because every piece could be potentially what gets me to sort of know what the front of the box looks like. Rarely do you get the complete, you know, top of the puzzle box when you're done, but you get enough to craft a story. And how I do it is just really years of experience in terms of knowing where to look, which archives to check out, being diligent. I subscribe to a number of digital databases that the average person wouldn't want to spend the money on, but, you know, I can leverage it by exploring so many different family histories, and that's where I find that data. Just dig. I mean, the internet makes it easier, but you can't get trapped by the internet because it also can be limiting, so you have to actually go beyond the internet.
That's interesting. I think many of us are interested in the historical reference of our family. A lot of us know a lot of information. Some of us know very little or none. And I think it's very powerful stuff because, by learning of our history, we learn a little bit more about ourselves. And just like history in situations that we're going through right now, a lot of times it repeats itself. And it's good to be able to look back at historical reference and understand what happened then.
That's absolutely correct, and I see it a lot in the DNA. So somebody didn't even know about an ancestor, and they take a DNA test, and I discover that ancestor, and it's amazing that ancestors' habits and styles and career choices and things that they did end up being in this person that's their descendant. I mean, it's bizarre. Now, in many cases, you don't see that because a lot of people earned a living as a farmer. So unless somebody's an active gardener or farmer today, you wouldn't know it. But in other choices that they make, being a good public speaker, for instance, happens to be something you can sort of track DNA-wise. So it's pretty amazing how well you realize how influenced people are today by just the DNA they inherited.
Powerful stuff. Well, Dan, I can't wait to see you back next week and throughout the month. And it's just powerful stuff with Dan. And I just seem to learn something new every day. And these are some really uplifting, good stories.
Yes, absolutely. I look forward to next week. I think I'll have a good story about back in the day challenges in terms of civil rights. I have to research it some more, but that's where I'm sort of leaning right now with my next week's story.